Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone. Let me welcome you all to the first lecture of the course, The History of English Language and Literature. At the outset, this being the first session, it's very important to give an overview of the course. This course is spread over 12 weeks and we may have 30 hours of teaching involved in this. And let me also introduce you to the objectives of this course so that the intentions become more clear. The first objective is to introduce the learners to the foundations of English language and literature, focusing on its emergence, evolution and progress through different ages and periods. The second one is to enable the learners to identify the key moments and events in the intellectual history of England. The third one is to equip the learners to critically evaluate or analyze a text within a socio-historical or political context. And the fourth one is to help understand the relevance of each period or era in the overall scheme of literary studies. Here we find that some of the concepts become very important in underlying the objectives of this course. In that sense, we shall be focusing on four major elements: the foundations, the intellectual history of the nation, the context and the relevance. So, as and when we progress in each session, you may also notice that most of our discussions will be highlighting these four major aspects, which would also form and refine the understanding of literary history in general. And before we move on, it's also important to take a look at the various texts and sources that shall be informing our understanding of the history of England and the history of literature during this course. So, this is a range of texts from which we have drawn our material from. The course will be focusing, including the material which is available from most of the major literary histories which has been written from the early 20th century onwards. In that sense, we shall be highlighting a couple of texts over here. The first one being the Outline History of English Literature by William Henry Hudson. We shall be following this book in order to get a framework of our understanding of history, and the details that Hudson does not talk about will be supplemented through our reading of the other texts, and a lot of other events which Hudson does not talk about, the socio-political context that are not mentioned in detail in Hudson, shall all be referred from the other texts. And in that sense, the Illustrated History of English Literature by Pat Rogers is also of supreme importance, because he gives a fairly balanced account of literary and non-literary events of the period quite simultaneously. And here we also see that G.M. Trevelyan's work, The English Social History, a Survey of 6 Centuries, it's very important to locate our understanding of the socio-political context, especially in the early centuries when English literature and even the nation of England was getting framed. So, overall, this is how the course is going to be structured, with the objectives in place and also drawing from a variety of sources which talk about the history of language and literature. At the outset itself, it's very important to make this distinction and to make you aware of what exactly we mean when we talk about English language and literature. English in this course is going to be used in a very limited linguistic and geographic sense. As Pat Rogers would put it, this is going to be the literature in English of the British people. So, we shall not be talking about the literature written in English outside this geographical center. Also, it's very important to highlight at the outset that this course does not engage with these other kinds of writings available in English, like American literature, African literature, Indian writing in English, Canadian literature, so on and so forth. So, this is going to be a discussion on the English literature produced from the island of England. And about the period that this course covers, this is going to be a history from wolf to wolf. Wolf being the first available text written in Old English, Beowulf, and Woolf being Virginia Woolf, the modernist writer. So, in a sense, this connection is very important to this course, because we shall be looking at a range of texts from the earlier times onwards, like texts like Beowulf, which do not even have a proper author, like the author is anonymous. And from then onwards, we shall be moving to the modern and postmodern period, when even the women writers begin to claim a space for themselves in the space of literature, in terms of publications, in terms of publishing, in terms of dissemination of work, so on and so forth. So, this connection and this range is very important for us to understand right at the outset, so that it will kind of set the tone for the course in the beginning. And what is the significance of literary history? One of the earlier historians, G.M. Trevelyan, he understands literary history as the product of the intellectual curiosity of a set of people, and he even opined that intellectual curiosity is the lifeblood of any civilization. Keeping this in mind, it's also important to figure out whether some of us find this connection between history and literature a little incongruous. But let me assure you at the beginning itself that this is not an incongruous relationship that literature and history shares, but it's a more organic and a more interconnected relationship. So, in that sense, what is literary history? If we go for a very simple definition, it's the chronological account of books and authors, talking about various influences that shape them, and some of these influences could also be shaping each other and also highlighting the ways in which language and literature, history and literature continue to inform each other. And what is the central purpose of any literary history? It is perhaps to give an account of the transformation of literature from period to period. Because when we talk about a chronological account, there is an inherent understanding that there is an inherent understanding that we are talking about a sequential order of literary and non-literary events from one set of events to the other. So, in that sense, the transformation and the connection between these different literatures, these different cultures also become supremely important. So, this is also with this inherent understanding that there are solid interactions between different literary cultures, and also that becomes very important in our understanding of the past and also in the shaping of what lies ahead. In that sense, we shall be tracing the intellectual ancestry of a particular literature, which also means we shall be tracing the intellectual ancestry of a particular community or even a particular nation. So, what do I mean by intellectual ancestry? This could be perhaps a sequential understanding of the rise and growth of various movements, various schools of thoughts and ideas. It could also mean the various kinds of imitations that are a reflection of the popularity of particular kinds of writing. It could also be the prevalent taste of a particular community or a province, and it can be the discussion of predecessors and successors and the relationship between them. So, this intellectual ancestry is very important, not just for understanding of literary history, but also for our understanding of a nation in general. So, it would be useful to remember that the origins of literary history in fact is also very connected to the origins of the nation state itself. And in literary history, we will begin to also note and highlight this fact that each author and each kind of writing is in fact positioned within the location of the nation. So, we would begin to see how there is an intimate connection between literary history and the general history, and how one goes on to inform the other. So, in that sense, the shaping of literary history is also quite connected with the shaping of a nation in particular. And the other important feature is that literary history is based on an idea of continuity, and this continuity is very important because when one moves from one school of thought to the other, or from literary age to the other, or even from one kind of an authority to the other, there is a sense of continuity which is built in, and literary history tries to highlight this connection. And even while we are trying to highlight this connection, it is useful to remember that the modern literary history is quite unlike the earlier kinds of prototypes of literary histories available, which could include chronicles, catalogues, so on and so forth. The earlier catalogues and chronicles perhaps merely narrated the facts, but in the later modern histories, we have not merely a narration of facts, but also a sense of a critical explanation available, which would also give a rationale for the continuity which is built into this structure of literary histories. And this continuity, we may often note that it is not always organic. It is also at times we find that historians at a later point have forcefully ensured a kind of continuity so that particular literary traditions live on, particular canonical structures do not get disturbed There could be many reasons for this, some of which we shall be looking at a later point. So, to sum up what exactly is literary history, it is a chronological account of books and authors and about the various influences that shape them. The influences could be socio-historical, political or economic, and it could also be combined with the influence of individuals, culture, ideals, the morals, the tendencies of the society, so on and so forth. There is a connection between literary history and general history. The nation is also of supreme importance in this. In that sense, when we are looking at the literary history of a nation, we should also be looking at the autobiography of a nation and also focusing on the literary traditions that have emerged. With this understanding, we move on to ask this very pertinent question: what is literary history a history of? We all know that the literary history is of a particular nation, a particular community, and perhaps a particular set of writings which have been brought together. But if we try to narrow it down a little further, does it include only the history of masterworks, or is it only about national literatures, or does it also include the subordinated groups? Do we talk about various genres and the hierarchies which are built in, and how do we position the various socio-economic forces? These many questions inform our understanding of literary histories in general, and some of these questions will also help us to critically evaluate the literary history which has been received from one generation to the other. As and when we discuss this, let me also highlight a few ways in which we shall be talking about literary history and the various aspects that define it throughout this course. Though in the postmodern era we celebrate the death of the author, in the understanding of literary history, the positioning of the author is of supreme importance. For example, when we begin to talk about a particular author, we may begin to talk about certain very mundane details, including his birth, family, person name, the occupation, when he died, the kind of wealth, the kind of status of wealth that he enjoyed, his friends and associates, and also moving on to other various life events that had perhaps defined not just his personal career but also his writing career. And we shall also be perhaps and one shall also perhaps begin to talk about some of the very important things that become central to our understanding of literary history itself, like cultural formation which went on to shape the author, the politics of the period which influenced the author, or maybe even things like religion and society which were instrumental in determining particular writing careers. So, here we begin to know that some of these aspects could be entirely personal, like the friends and associates one shared, or the family into which one is born, the kind of wealth status that one's family had, so on and so forth. But there are also these things like the cultural formations, the politics of the period, the societal formations, etc., which could perhaps be shared by more than one author. So, this becomes important in assigning subgroups for each author, or even identifying particular forms of writing that emerged in a society in a particular age, so on and so forth. So, this is perhaps one of the ways in which we begin to locate the author within the literary history. And there are also various aspects of a text that needs to be covered. So, when we talk about a text, it could be a book, it could be a performance, it could be any kind of cultural or artistic production. So, when we look at the text and try to locate it within the literary history, we shall be looking at various of these aspects, which could include issues related to genre, the date and place of publication, or perhaps the kind of characterization that it involved, the voice or narration in the text, so on and so forth. And all of these become important in not just narrating where the text belongs to, but also in critically evaluating and critically seeing the connection between various literary traditions, and also in locating the predecessor and successor of particular kinds of writing. And this is another interesting aspect. When we talk about literary history, we should also be talking about the reception of not just authors and texts, but also of ideas. In that sense, we shall be talking about a particular author's best known work, or the kind of influences that this author or a text had on other things, and maybe about the recognition value, and even about the penalties that one incurred for writing a particular kind of thing, when we later begin to talk about censorship of getting into loggerheads with the authority of each period, when we shall be talking about the various penalties as well, and also about some of the works which get destructed either due to a natural calamity or even due to another political or socio-economic force. So, these are the various aspects that we shall be looking at. And we shall also be looking at the various modes of production of text. This is very important in our understanding. It could include details of authorship, about the attitudes and motives, it could be literary and non-literary, and the mode of publication, the submissions and rejections that a particular text or an author or an idea incurred during its lifetime, the rarities, features, decorations of that involved, that's part of production, and the manuscript history, especially with regard to the earlier texts from the Old English and early Middle English period. This becomes important in understanding how a text had been disseminated over a period of time even before the advent of printing. So, these are the various aspects which we need to keep in mind when we talk about literary histories and the particular connections to authors, to texts, to nations, to communities, to identities, to on and so forth. So, in the recent decades, in fact, there is a surge of works on literary histories in general, which could be referred to on the whole as literary history studies. These are some of the seminal texts that have begun to inform our ways of understanding literary histories, and also calling for a rewriting of the existing literary histories. Now, we come to another important aspect of literary histories, which is literary periodization. So, as and when we progress through this course, we may begin to note that our discussion is conveniently based on particular literary periods or literary ages. So, why are these segments brought into place? This division into segments, which are loosely termed as periods, it is primarily for the convenience of discussion, because it would be easier to club a set of authors or a set of writings or particular modes of production into different segments and periods. And this periodization is also based on a general consensus, so that all of us know what we are talking about. It is easier to refer to an age, and immediately image of the age will come to everyone's mind. That makes the discussion more lively, and also the understanding is also enhanced. And a curious fact about this aspect of periodization is that these are not rigorously fixed at all. They are more or less arbitrary, and in that sense we find many historians and many critics even arguing about the different starting points. For example, if one could talk about the origins of English literature, there are a few historians who argue that it should begin with the Anglo-Saxon period. There are a few who identify Beowulf as the first literary text in English, but there are also a set of historians who argue that English literature cannot have any other starting point than that of Chaucer. So, in that sense, there is a certain arbitrariness which allows a lot of flexibility, and which also allows literary history to remain as fascinating and as interesting as ever. And the periodization is also important to ensure a sense of continuity, which would enable us to understand how one period seamlessly emerge from the other, or it will also help us to highlight the connections between these different periods, which are seemingly very different, but also the understanding of the transition will allow us to be aware of the various common factors and the various connections which are built into the structure. And the method of classification into different periods or different segments, that could also be either arbitrary or it could be based on certain factors. And some of the times we find that the classification could be based on epithets from history, like one could have the terms like Elizabethan age or Jacobean age, or we could even classify this age loosely based on the most prominent writer of the period, like Chaucer's age or the age of Shakespeare or the age of Johnson. And it could also be based on a major school of thought like metaphysical poetry, or at a later point modernist writing, postmodernist fiction, so on and so forth. So, this is also, there is a certain arbitrariness involved in it, and it could also be based on certain commonalities and certain dominant preferences. So, this kind of arbitrariness built into it and the lack of rigid structures has also led to the emergence of various kinds of classification and various kinds of periodization. But this is the loosely the periodization which is followed in most of the dominant works on literary history. In this course also we will be more or less sticking to this form of periodization and highlighting the problematizations as and when they are required. And in that sense we shall be going through, in that sense we shall be beginning with the Old English period through Middle English period, then the features of Renaissance, moving on to the Neoclassical period and highlighting the Romantic period through the Victorian age, and then moving on to the modern and the postmodern period. We will also see here that there are a set of authors which seem to be more representative and more dominant compared to the others. But however, I would like to highlight at this point that our discussion will not be limited to these authors who are being highlighted, but these names are being given here to show the connection and show the chronological order in which the discussion would be loosely based on. This might lead us to also assume that the understanding of literary history is quite simple, in the sense that the chronological account seem to be quite clear. There is a linear kind of an understanding from Beowulf to Chaucer, from Chaucer to Shakespeare, from Shakespeare to Milton, from Milton to Wordsworth, from Wordsworth to Tennyson, so on and so forth. But the interesting thing is that this is not so linear. We shall not just be talking about, as we had highlighted, we shall not just be talking about the various authors and the various works that they produced, but there is going to be a plethora of things that come into the discussion. We shall be talking about past, sense of tradition, about artistic forms, about various genres, about print culture, about the standpoints, about the political opinions which inform the understanding of a text, about native traditions, about the heritages, about literary reputations. So, there is a vast range of topics that will inform our understanding of this seemingly linear discussion from Beowulf till the modern times. So, with this introduction, we begin to wind up the first lecture. So, I also assume that you have got a clear understanding of what literary history is and how we would be going about this course using literary history as a central framework. And as we move on, we will begin to look at how origins are being created, how various forms of transitions are being enabled, and in between our discussions of the literary and non-literary features, we shall also be talking about how language continues to evolve through all of these ages and how language continues to be influenced by the various aspects of literature, socio-political and cultural issues, so on and so forth. So, with this we come to the end of this lecture. Thank you for listening and see you in the next session.